Roirí, your podcast, Love and Courage, has had millions of fascinating guests, is very popular, and has a weird name. So, what motivated you to start it, and where did you get the name from?
So my background is roughly loosely in the community world. Started work as a kind of youth worker and worked for the health service, and then got involved in I suppose social activism, realising that the state can't necessarily deliver a lot of the social solutions that we need. So I got involved in activism, and through that started using the media a lot in terms of trying to get voices out there, underheard voices or less heard voices. So kind of learned the ropes a little bit of the media. But throughout that, kind of started meeting the most fascinating people, and quite often for me they were people that I felt needed to be heard, or I believed that there should be more diversity of these voices, whether they be Irish or from elsewhere. So I suppose really just over the years I developed this incremental frustration with the state of the media, or the diversity of mainstream media, but also a love in particular of radio, and a love of conversation, and a love of listening and learning. And most of my the richest learning I've ever had in my own life are in one-to-one conversations, and particularly also with sometimes older people, where we don't necessarily get to hear from them. The kind of, I won't define older here, but generally, you know, there tends to be a kind of a pop culture where, you know, you're relevant in your 20s, 30s and 40s, and so really from there I just said, well, I'll just do it myself. So Love and Courage, the name, I suppose I did a presentation to the Oireachtas Health Committee a couple of years ago around alcohol and drug abuse in Ireland, and I kind of came away feeling that they know all this, that I was kind of wasting my time, and that the missing thing wasn't information, it was actually courage. And it just led me to kind of reflect on the word courage for the last number of years as a missing ingredient in society, that quite often we know what the fuck we need to be doing, but we don't have the courage to do it. So why not shine a light on courageous people? And I suppose the word love can be a contentious one in some sense. It can evoke all sorts of fluffy or religious, or, you know, there's all sorts of ways of looking at love. But I am with John Lennon on the whole thing. When it all boils down, you know, all you need is love. But particularly from an activist perspective, are you coming from a place of love in your desire to change the world? Because I've no great desire to spend an hour listening to someone that is kind of hate-filled or rage-filled and is going to leave me more depressed than when I started interviewing them. So I try and leave the listener feeling hopeful and positive and compelled to action, which is the courageous bit. So,
do you bring a recording device with you when you go places, or do you know who you're going to try and get an interview with, or do you just...
My interview trajectory is very kind of intuitive, in the sense that I recently heard that there was a revolutionary Catalonian nun coming to Ireland who's also pro-choice, and I was like, I have to meet this woman, and the next day I was interviewing her. Others I might have on my wish list, but I just try and, the main thing is that I try and keep the actual joy and love in the process, because there was a couple of times there the podcast was starting to become mature, and if you kind of lose that joy out of it, then you might as well be doing something else, because there's certainly no money in it. So if there's, you know, you certainly need to keep the joy, and I need to remind myself why I'm doing it, and if I'm enjoying it, hopefully the listener will enjoy it.
Yeah. So Taz, your podcast also has a weird name.
Yes.
Why are you in a shower?
Okay, so my podcast is called In the Shower with Taz and Marcus, and it's a bite-sized, informative podcast, about 15 minutes long, give or take 2 minutes, and we answer questions that listeners send in, like mythical questions that they've always wanted the answer to but never quite went as far as looking up. So, why do we never see baby pigeons? Why do we fart? Why do we fall in love? Is there a correct way to wipe your bum? Everything and anything you can imagine. And how I came about this podcast, I worked in the States for a while, as Alan mentioned, and it was about 3-4 years ago, and it was in the States at that time, podcasting was massive, and back here at home it was kind of only beginning to start. And when I came back here, my visa ran out, I was kind of disheartened, didn't really know where to go, didn't really have a huge audience here. And when I went about asking people why they didn't listen to podcasts, they always said that they didn't have time. So it kind of got me thinking about breaking up someone's day and carving out a time in the day when they can listen to my podcast. So when people get into the car in the morning, second nature is they turn on the radio, they listen to their morning radio show in their head. Driving to work means listening to their favourite radio show. Drive time radio is the same. When somebody is driving home, they stick on the radio. Driving home means consuming that media, means listening to that radio show. Similar again, most newspapers are sold on a Sunday because in people's minds they think on a Sunday is chill out time, I'll sit back in front of a fire and read the newspaper. So I kind of thought about that and thought, where can I convince people in their week is the time to listen to my podcast, where listening to my podcast becomes second nature. So breaking down the day, I thought in the shower loads of people listen to music, I myself listen to podcasts, and if it became entwined in people's minds that it's as simple, it's so simple to listen to this podcast that you can listen to it while you're in the shower, then it doesn't seem like a chore or a big deal to open up your app and click play. So that's kind of how it came about. So it's 15 minutes long. Everybody showers at least once a week, we hope, and it comes out weekly. So the point is, so it can be listened to while you're in the shower. And I don't think, and it's definitely not the case that most of our listeners listen in the shower, but it's that light bulb in your head that it's so simple to listen to it, you can listen to it in the shower, that you can listen to it any time of the day. So it's just 15 minutes snippet, no excuse not to listen. I expect to have 16 of our listeners by the end of the day.
Roisin, that's what Taz was talking about there, is to be able to carve out a time of the day is obviously an unbelievable freedom with podcasting as compared to something like radio. Is that sort of freedom something that drew you to podcasting?
Yeah, I mean, just a bit about my background. In another lifetime, I actually had a radio show on News Talk, and Gareth, who was involved in it, at the back of the room there. And it's funny, when I think back to that, I mean, it was a great opportunity to have at the time. It was a very daunting opportunity too, because I hadn't ever had a radio show before. And I'll never forget my first ever broadcast. I mean, I wouldn't be able to listen to it now because I'd die, because I know, because my mother nearly had to resuscitate me afterwards. You could actually hear my voice. It wasn't I'm not exaggerating when I say it was welcome to, the show was called Weekend Blend, and I know it was horrific. And I actually thought after that first episode, I don't know what you're doing this is awful, it's a disaster. But I suppose with everything, I got more confidence. But I always found the live element of it very daunting, and the knowledge that as you were talking, there was all this audience out there, and I spoke to lots of people over the years, like Gay Byrne, and they would talk about picturing one person, or and that did help. But I also found it wasn't something that came necessarily very naturally to me. I didn't feel like I started it and went, yeah, I'm amazing at this. I definitely grew into it. I hopefully got better. You can ask Gareth later, but than what I was in that first episode. So that was a brilliant opportunity. I learned so much, and it was brilliant to just have all the people coming into the studio and talking. But again, another challenging aspect of the live situation was the constant ads, the news bulletins, and having to manage all that as well, and having a really interesting conversation with someone, just getting to the heart of what they were about and having to cut it short, So that was always something that was kind of a little bit frustrating. So then my other life is in print journalism, obviously, and I had a column in the Irish Times for 15 years talking about myself. And a few years ago, the Irish Times decided to go into podcasting. And which it was very exciting to do. There was no other newspaper doing it, and interesting as well, as to how it would work out and why we were doing it. But I think it's about the fact that obviously print media is not as successful as it used to be, to put it mildly, and that any newspaper that's going to stay in business has to explore all these different avenues. So the Irish Times was doing that. We had a business podcast, a politics podcast, a world podcast. So we started quite, with a few strong ones. I had one called Roisin Meets, which was basically me talking to one usually high-profile individual, but not necessarily. Again, like Ruairi was saying, and I need to get the name of that revolutionary pro-choice nun off you. Just coming across people that you just thought, wow, what a great story. Okay, nobody knows their name, but I know that I can talk to this person for 40 minutes, and by the end of it, people will feel that was great. So I immediately liked podcasting for the reason that I didn't have to have that tremor in my voice, and if I ever said something stupid, which I often do, I could go to the sound guy, JJ, would you mind like snipping that out? And there's a real luxury in that, but also having done it now for a few years, I feel like I'm definitely a much better broadcaster because the fear has kind of gone now, and I think that if like Gareth wanted to give me another job again, I would come back to it with a much greater confidence. So in terms of the freedom in that way, I think the whole pre-recorded thing is important to talk about because live radio is a very different animal, and I just take my hat off to those people who do it and are so quick on their feet, and it's brilliant, but it's a different beast. So the other thing I just want to mention is, so I have that podcast, Roisin Meets, but then early on in our podcasting days in the Irish Times, we did some research. We just wanted to find out who was listening to these podcasts. And what we discovered, and the figures came back, and I got the email, and no one else seemed to be particularly perturbed by it, but I was just amazed to find that, I think it was something like 90 or 95% of our listeners were men. I mean, literally, the only women that seemed to be listening to any of our podcasts were listening to my podcast, maybe because, there was a woman presenting it, I don't know why. But I found that kind of horrible, like, just from a commercial kind of point of view, that there was a whole section of our audience that weren't being turned on by the podcast offerings that we had. So I just decided we need to do something about that, and that's how the women's podcast came about. With a group of us in the Irish Times, women came together. We did great it was one of those, it was a very exciting moment, like 15 of us in the boardroom of the Irish Times, just saying, right, this is a really amazing opportunity. And we came up with, the name, I know it's a bit what it says on the tin, and we did go around the houses with lots of different names. We had a brilliant name that we couldn't use because some crowd in England had the same name, and it was Sound Women. And I got in touch with these sound women in England who weren't using it in the cool way that we would be using it. And I was like, hi, sound means something really different in Ireland, and I think, like, in fairness, I'm talking about sound in both the ways, and they're just like, yeah, but we just mean sound women, and, we're legally going to go after you if you try to use it. And now, I don't think it's still going. So, but anyway, if anyone wants to start a podcast with sound women, I think it's a really good idea.
Registers.
So the freedom is that it's what I spoke about, like not having to be interrupted, being able to go in depth. I think podcasts are, when you think about where people listen to them, whether it's in the shower or it's in their car or it's out walking, you're filling this really intimate space, I think, and I'm very conscious of it when I'm making the podcast. I feel like it's really, well, radio does this anyway. We're allowed to conjure up the pictures in our head. We're allowed to imagine the things. I love a bit of a good old Netflix binge, but I'm in a very different place than when I have been recently listening to West Cork. I don't know if has anyone listened to West Cork here? Yeah, well, the thing is, it's on Audible and you have to pay for it, and I was just laughing here. I actually paid for something on the internet. I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my God. But I'm telling you something, it is so worth paying for. This series, a story that's been under our noses for over 20 years, these two English people came over and spent 3 years just looking at the case, and it is extraordinary broadcasting. But anyway, so you're in there, whether you're listening to it in bed at night before you go to bed, it's this intimate thing. And with the podcast that I do, we just try to tell stories and really get in depth with interviews. So we've had all sorts of people. Again, it's a bit like Ruairi said, it's people that you come across or people that I'm fans of. I'll often just reach out on Twitter and go, any chance Caitlin Moran, will you come on the women's podcast? And she will, and she'll come on the phone. And so it's all different people. We've had like Margaret Atwood, we've had Caitlin, as I said, and just all sorts of different people. But also for the women's podcast, it's kind of, I really feel that we're filling a space that was really not being served in the Irish market, whether in podcasts or in traditional broadcasting. So we're talking to women about everything, like from, empowering things, whether it's fashion, makeup, it's contraception, it's women in politics. It's not all about, like, we're very keen not to just have a sort of a wine fest or a moan fest, because being a woman is great, and we try to touch all of that. It is a predominantly female audience, but I think there are some, I'm sure Ruairi and Cormac, I'm sure are avid listeners to the women's podcast.
Yeah.
That was very convincing.
None of the last one I listened to was about the sexist songs.
Oh yeah, but that was a very good one.
That people women still like. I thought it was fascinating.
And that was an interesting one. It's about how some songs in the pop lexicon are really not good to women. Like the lyrics don't, but women still listen to them, and that's okay, and why it's okay to do that. But also talking about the freedom. Just to finish on this. we also had a podcast a few months ago where I got lots of men in to talk about their experiences of abortion, as in travelling with people. And for me, and it was funny because we've had men on the women's podcast only maybe a handful of times, and it always has to be very important sort of reason why we have them on. And these 4 men sat in our studio, and it was like a 50-minute broadcast of just them talking about having travelled with their wives or their girlfriends, or not travelled or made different choices. And I suppose for me, podcasting is looking at kind of what traditional radio is doing, and then looking at how you can do things differently. I'm not saying better. I don't think it's a compare and contrast thing. It's just a different space where you can fill it with different content, and you get more space to do that, and you just you tell stories to people. So I feel very lucky to be doing it. I mean, I have a whole other full-time job, so it's a little bit, we've 2 episodes of the women's podcast that come out on Monday and Thursday. Please listen to it. I know there's mostly men here, but honestly there's something for everyone in the audience. And Roisin Meets comes out on a Friday, so I'm doing that on top of my job as well. But it's one of those things that I just love doing, so I don't like to say it too much that I love it, because then they'll think it's not work, because it is work. But it's just wonderful to do a job that actually, I go into that studio and I'm just delighted to be in a position where I can do it. So yeah, it's been a great journey, and we've just recently started a new sports podcast, which you might be more interested in, some of you in the room, and so you can check that out as well. But that's sort of my story there.
Great. I do have to take you up on a couple of things there, though. You did say you were broadcasting, and West Cork was a broadcast.
Oh yes, not a
Netcast.
broadcast. Oh, sorry, it's a netcast. Yes, the West Cork netcast is very good. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Cormac, you can pretty much podcasting. You can kind of do anything, right? You've got the freedom. You can pretty much do whatever the hell you want, which is a big advantage over radio. So I think understandably some radio people are a little bit worried about all this, all of what's happening. But are there opportunities for radio in this?
Yeah, I definitely think so, and I know some people here are coming from a programming side, digital side, and I do recognise some sales heads, but I also saw that, Ruairi, when you said there's no money in it, they left straight away, so yeah. So
I love it.
So that was
well, like the farmers, we have to cry that there's no money.
Yeah, so some grants and some quotas, but no, because I know there's always been the worry about radio stations looking at the podcast as taking away listeners, and you know the holy grail is still the J and L's for radio stations, and that if you're going to be promoting another audio source to listen to, is that not going to undermine your own radio programming? And I was having to think about that during the week, and I was like, potentially yes, but at the same time, I also think there's an opportunity that there's nothing to say that people can listen to more podcasts, and if they're enjoying listening to audio, what's to say that they won't increase their listenership of radio as well? You know what I mean? So you could technically see it as a way to grow the market. But I think radio is in a very unique position in that it has absolutely everything to kind of dominate podcasting if they wanted to. Like, I started off my podcast recording into my wardrobe because it was the only soundproofing I could get. You know what I mean? So I had the microphone into the wardrobe to get some dampening. So when if you look at a radio station, you've broadcast quality equipment, you've broadcast quality studios, and from a monetization point of view, you've also got an entire sales department. And as well, I was thinking as well, like radio is limited from a commercial aspect of usually 7 to 7, to 7 a.m., 7 to p.m. You've only got 4 or 5 shows a day that you can sponsor. You're limited by your 24 hours of sponsorship potential per day. If you go into podcasting, you've technically got a very easy way to increase your advertising inventory, if that makes sense. So you're not just limited to 5 shows you can sponsor. Now you can get 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 extra shows on top of that package. So I think it's a very cost-effective way to start expanding out your programming and create really good stuff as well, because the one thing that radio stations have that independent podcasters don't have is tons and tons and tons of data about your listeners, because you're talking about the Irish Times releasing specific niche podcasts. I mean, what I would see a really good idea for radio stations to do is to look at their analytics on every platform and see where's their biggest market or where's a niche market, and kind of go, you can come from the aspect of, well, what would you love to do or what would be very popular, and kind of figure out what your listeners want, categorize them, and then say we're going to try do a podcast for lads between the ages of 18 and 24 about UFC. That could be very popular, and I think you could experiment that way. And again, it would be very cost effective to do that, because you have the information, you have the infrastructure, you have the people. And I think as well there's an opportunity there. We all know from working in radio that there's tons of people on the fringes who would love more airtime, and there's tons of people who would absolutely love to get their own show. And unfortunately, again, they're limited by the 24 hours in the day. Unfortunately, the schedules aren't very flexible. I mean, there's tons of, even promo staff who are just getting in the game who would love to be on air. So you turn around to them and say, go do something and come back to me in 2 months and see what you have. And I think there's a huge opportunity there for, a worrying opportunity for us, in that radio could come and just dominate. Do you know what I mean? And there's been 2 times I was on radio. I was on Today FM in with Joe, promoting my podcast, and it topped the charts. And it topped the charts because radio has a captive audio audience who like listening to stuff. So there is a threat there. Obviously, as I said, traditional media is under threat with internet and everything. It's on shaky ground. But I think, I think if you act quick enough and I said you have everything in place to create an amazing quality podcast, and you can I think really do that, and do that well if you're willing to give it the time, care and attention it needs. But even we were just chatting beforehand, I think I always thought when I get into my podcast episode it's a documentary style podcast that kind of looks at different topics, but it takes me about a month to do one episode, just because of the people I'm trying to get and stuff like that. So I know radio sometimes is under pressure to get stuff out there, but I would say if you were to look at it from a year, 2 or 3 year perspective, if you can build something very, very good and very, very solid and release a top quality podcast, you are starting from a much better place than someone who's just, as I said, recording into their wardrobe, if that helps or makes sense.
And just in terms of those opportunities, I think Women's Hour in England do a very good thing where they curate sort of the best of the week as well. So there's that opportunity too for traditional broadcasting. So on a Saturday, you get to, if you've missed a load of the episodes during the week, you get to kind of hear the highlights. I think that's something that could happen more here with podcasters.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you think radio should be doing? Like, do you think, could Today FM make Serial?
Yes.
Well, for the likes of Serial, there was a huge budget, much like West Cork, and years of research into it. For something like Serial or S-Town or West Cork, it's a massive commitment thing. And
but I mean, the Criminal Court of Justice are just down the road.
Yeah. I still think on a smaller scale, I'm surprised so far, and not just with traditional broadcasts, but with podcasters, like you're doing documentaries, but there aren't that many. I mean, I think the storytelling in Ireland is incredible, and when I think that starts to happen, we could dominate in a sort of international way. It just hasn't happened yet. It's interesting that these 2 English people came to West Cork and spent 3 years, and like I say, a story that's under our noses, and there's so many stories like that in Ireland that if you actually dug down into them in that way, that it could be fantastic. But it's like the money, it's the time.
But I think, like, for me, I would just see it as it's just a time investment. And other stations are obviously going to have to pay people. And you can't turn around to some people and say, "Well, you do it for free." But at the same time, if I was looking to try and get into radio, I would do it without getting paid initially. So, I mean, I think there's a golden opportunity right now for somebody to document the repeal movement and do now until the vote and see what happens, and then see what they come out at the end of it. I think that would be, and I think you could do something regardless of the outcome. Something could be done very, very powerful and well there, you know what I mean? But you have to be willing to
steal that idea. Okay,
there you go.
So nobody else can do that.
But I think something like that, if you're willing to plan ahead and do the time and be willing to spend 2, 3, 4 months without seeing a return, and then radio has the resources to package it up and advertise it across channels. So you're doing video grabs, you're doing, whether it's Facebook Live, you're doing promoting it across station, you know, emailing it out. So I think there's huge opportunity to let people go and do something within the station and then figure out which is going to land the best. And as I said, like there's now an infinite number of hours in your day for extra shows that you could never do. So there's nothing, there's nothing stopping you putting it out there. So I think that's what I say should be doing. I know it's a different story on a day-to-day basis trying to manage that. I
think going back to Alan's question of what radio stations should be doing, I think on a base level, just not turning a blind eye to podcasting, not being afraid of it. Speaking to loads of people in the radio world, it seems like this big demon that's, you know, going to steal everyone's jobs and kill radio stations. But as Cormac really put really, really well there. You know, there's an opportunity for radio stations to get involved in this podcasting game. Don't turn a blind eye to it. Don't pretend it's not there. Don't pretend it's something completely different than radio. People who think podcasting is this one game and radio is this other, it's not. They're so intertwined. So I think, just getting involved.
Yeah, and on that as well, there's some really good Irish podcasts out there as well, but there's some really bad Irish podcasts out there as well. One thing I've noticed is that people who seem to come from, like, I think radio presenting still makes sense in a podcasting platform. You know, it's a good radio presenter. You'll probably know with simple things like hooking and teasing and just small things like that. I don't hear some Irish podcasters doing which would be better. And, you know, you do have freedom in a podcast to kind of go down tangents that you usually wouldn't go down, which can lead to gems of information and gems of jokes. So I still think, as I said, the talent in radio stations to be able to produce really good podcasts, I think, is a massive advantage that radio could destroy all four of us in a week if it wanted to. You know what I mean?